No. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sherry Turner. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives here at Rhodes College and also the Chief Diversity Officer. Welcome to Rhodes Responds, Black Communities in Law Enforcement and Law Enforcement. This is the first in a three-part series about Black communities and law enforcement. Our conversation tonight and over the next 2 weeks will engage scholars and experts from the Rhodes College community, as well as local Memphis leaders, policymakers, and change makers in conversations about recent protests and police brutality, the history of racism against Black communities, and calls for reform. As an academic community, Rhodes College is committed to fostering an inclusive and just community. And we recognize that doing so requires us to understand the current conditions, to engage in self-reflection, to grapple with our own past failures and limitations, but also to embrace the change that is necessary to move forward. And so in the same way, we recognize that creating an inclusive and just society requires the same type of commitment to understand the state of current affairs, to reflect on our past limitations and failures, ideologies and practices, and to plot a path towards our goal. Fortunately, here at Rhodes, we have scholars within this community, this academic community, and partners within the larger Memphis community that can help guide us in thinking specifically about challenges of law enforcement in Black communities. Each of the 3 webinars that will be a part of this series will take on aspects of that. I would, before we get started, like to recognize our organizers for their foresight in organizing the series, Dr. Dwayne Loins, Dr. Aixa Marchand, and Dr. Kendra Holtz. I appreciate their thoughtfulness and their concern for communities and their willingness to bring the academic resources that Rhodes has to bear on the societal challenges that we're currently facing. I also would like to acknowledge and thank our president, Dr. Marjorie Haas, for her unwavering support of this particular set of conversations we'll be engaged in. And I'd like to acknowledge that tonight's program is presented by the Rhodes College Meiman Center. And so tonight, as we engage in our conversation, we are blessed to have 3 experts who can help assist us in understanding where we are now, specifically on understanding the current protests that are taking place across our nation regarding to the relationship of law enforcement to African-American communities. And so I'd like to take a moment and introduce our panelists who have so graciously agreed to share their time, their perspectives, and their expertise with us. First of all, we have Commissioner Tami Sawyer. Shelby County Commissioner Sawyer represents District 7 in Memphis, and she is the chair of the Community Services Committee. Commissioner Sawyer is an activist, leader, and change agent, and she currently serves as the National Field Director of Black Voters Matter, and she's also the founder of #Take'emDown901, which is a movement to remove Confederate statues here in Memphis. Commissioner Sawyer was recently recognized by Ebony magazine as part of the 2018 Power 100 list. Commissioner Sawyer, we welcome you. Our second panelist is Dr. Earle Fisher. Reverend Dr. Earle Fisher is senior pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church here in Memphis. He is a well-known activist as well, and also is someone who is widely respected for his community engagement. Dr. Fisher serves as the 2019-2020 Henry Logan Starks Fellow at Memphis Theological Seminary. And in that role, he helps to empower faculty, students, staff, and community leaders to think critically about theology, liberation, and racial and economic justice. Reverend Fisher, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Our third panelist is Dr. Earl Wright. I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Wright as one of the newest members of the Rhodes College faculty. Dr. Wright will be professor of sociology here at Rhodes. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the contributions of African Americans and of historically Black colleges and universities to the field of sociology. And in particular, he is a noted scholar on W.E.B. Du Bois and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. Dr. Wright has been recognized for his distinguished scholarly contributions on race and the South, and he brings particular insights on masculinity and policing. Dr. Wright, we welcome you to Rhodes, and we welcome you to this evening's panel. I'd like to say a word to our audience. Our format for this evening will engage a lot of conversation among our panelists. We'll take a few moments to have them share some of their perspectives, but we want this to be a conversation, and so we welcome you as members of the audience to submit your questions in the Q&A box that should be located at the bottom of your screen. And so let's begin our conversation for tonight. And so for each of our panelists, I'd like to invite you to help us set the tone by giving us a brief overview of your particular vantage point, either as an elected official or sociologist or as a pastor, theologian. What is it that you are seeing with respect to the relationship between Black communities and law enforcement?
Thank you so much for having us, Dr. Turner, and for to the entire Rhodes College community for bringing these important panels together. As commissioner in District 7, I see many things. It's one of the most diverse districts. Rhodes is a part of this district. And just behind Rhodes stands Springdale and Hyde Park, two of the poorest zip codes in Memphis that are almost 100% Black. Also, we have to the east, we have the Heights and we have Binghamton, which are even more diversifying in terms of the international population. And I would just like to acknowledge Dr. Ha's statement today in support of the international students, which I thought was a very well done statement in support of our international community. As commissioner and as an activist, what I see right now is that we are in a very tough time in the relationship between Black people and police. Historically, we have always wanted to support the police in their roles in our community. We are raised to do so, to respect officers, to respect authority. But we are also raised from a very young age to recognize that there is the intersection of abuse and violence in our relationship with the police. We know this from a young age. I was 12 when Rodney King was beaten. And I was 10 the first time I ever saw an officer speak to my father in a way that I know he would have never spoken to any white man. And so regardless of the way we are raised in our community and the Christian religion and the ways that I'm sure Pastor Fisher will get into, we are also grappling with the reality that it's 2020, and with all of our technological advances, the images that we're now seeing every day on television are the images that we've seen every day for 400 years, whether they were patrolling slave plantations or they were patrolling Springdale or Hollywood. And so in my community, people are trying to figure out, how do we support the police? How do we respect the authority we're taught to respect? And also, how do we demand a new form of justice? How do we build a new model that values Black lives?
Thank you for that.
As Commissioner Sawyer said, thank you, Dr. Turner, and to the Rhodes family for hosting this. And it's definitely a necessary conversation. Similar to Commissioner Sawyer, my dear sister, I see this moment at the intersection of a couple of different vantage points. One is as a faith leader, obviously, also as a scholar and as a social activist. So sitting at that intersection, I can recognize the tension between people who want to deal with the structural, the systemic, the institutional, and the organizational realities. Then I also see the people who want to deal with more anecdotal and individual realities that matter as well. So from a faith perspective, I can't help but see this from the standpoint of injustice, exploitation, and oppression, which is a byproduct of the white supremacist foundation of the country, which Khalil Muhammad would say is the foundation of the condemnation of Blackness. So I was talking to a reporter just yesterday after a press conference that some faith leaders did, and she was asking me about the way that the current administration and the police department are trying to engage in talks and conversations. And I'm trying to challenge this primary premise that they have, which is the more you increase law enforcement officers, the more you decrease crime, which data of all sorts proves to be dishonest and untrue. So I say that if you walk around with a hammer of mass incarceration, then everything looks like a nail of Black criminality. So we are suffering from a deficit of a sociological, and I would argue a theological imagination that can see human beings made in the image of God who bear Black skin as being just as valuable, just as humane, just as flawed, just as creative, and just as compassionate as our other brothers and sisters who we share the space of the world with. So it's an interesting space to be in, and hopefully we can move the needle forward in the next few months.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Wright.
Dr. Turner, I want to thank you for welcoming me to Rhodes College. It's great to be home, a native Memphian, and I literally grew up less than 2 miles from Rhodes. And I remember walking past that college on numerous occasions, and it may as well have been a world away for people like me who grew up outside those walls within Commissioner Sawyer's district. So I'm glad to see Rhodes is having these hard and difficult conversations, and I'm hoping that it will lead to great fruit that will come in years to come.
Thank you.
My contribution, I see it as a supplement to what Dr. Fisher and Commissioner Sawyer just said. What I am really interested in my research is looking at the ways or the consequences of hyper-policing and the over-legislating of Black bodies and the Black community. So where there are instances where death is not the result, how does the harvesting of Black bodies in prisons lead to intended and unintended consequences? And some of those intended consequences have corporate financial benefits and repercussions. So I think it's critical that while we shine a light on the ways in which our bodies are being brutalized for public display, that we should also look at the consequences that happen to Black bodies when we are over-policed and we live, but we're housed in facilities where our labor is exploited, for the lack of a better expression. So my contribution will be that.
Okay, thank you for that. And so, Dr. Wright, I'm wondering, given that you are a researcher, scholar, sociologist, can you help our audience sort of understand the context of what's happening nationally? Specifically, what is it about policing that either currently or historically has a negative impact on Black communities? And why are we seeing all of these protests today? Can you just help us to understand the context of what's happening in our society?
Well, that's a two-part question. I'll take the second part first.
Okay.
Why are we seeing these protests today? One of the things I try to instruct my students on in my Sociology of Racism course is to understand why you see Black and brown people on television angrily expressing their frustration at what's taking place. And what I argue is that there's a discrepancy between what we know as a racial entity being Black people, which may be at a level of 10, as opposed to what non-Black people may know, which may be at a level 4. So because there's this strain, there's a difficulty for non-Black people to understand that we're not simply rioting in Baltimore or engaging in civil unrest in Baltimore and in Ferguson and in Memphis and in Cincinnati because we are just by nature violent and want to do deviant things. But we have this historical knowledge of what happened not only to ourselves and our bodies, but to my parents' bodies, to my grandparents' bodies, to generations of Black people who have had to endure the horrors of policing, which, as it relates to Black bodies, policing has always been extreme in the ways in which it's dealt with Blacks, going back to the arrival of the first Africans in 1619. But we don't have to go that far. We can even look in the 1960s when, through the use of the comedic device, persons like Richard Pryor, in a funny way, tried to describe how he did not want to be a victim of a mistake by a police officer. So he says loudly, "I'm reaching in my pocket. I do not want to be a effing mistake. I don't want to be an accident." So historically, these are things that Blacks have had to deal with, unfortunately. The only thing that's new, as Commissioner Sawyer alluded to earlier, is that it's on video. We can see what's happening now. And unfortunately, in some situations, although it's video recorded, it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of the response, but it is taking us a step further. But in closing, I do want to say that we should also remember that even when these Black bodies survive, we are harvested in these, not concentration camps, but these prisons, and labor exploited, voting rights taken away, and other kind of financial implications of us once we are released, if we're released.
Thank you for that. That is a very comprehensive response, and I appreciate the fact that you were able to sort of take this and also sort of link it to what's happening in a corporate context, but also very clearly to talk about the impact of policing and prison on subsequent labor and labor rights, as well as voting rights and the financial well-being, not only of individuals, but also of families and communities too. And so I'm going to turn to Commissioner Sawyer and Dr. Fisher, I'm sorry. Both of you have been engaged in this movement in Memphis. Dr. Wright has been helpful in pointing us to, helping us to understand sort of the national picture. But given your engagement right here in Memphis, can you sort of help us to understand what is it that's happening in Memphis proper? What are you seeing? Help us to understand this local context.
Well, I was going to yield to the commissioner, but I would start by saying, you know, Tami and I met on the battlefield for social justice related to what I would call criminal injustice reform, because right now the state of criminal justice is very unjust. And so we met in 2015 when Darius Stewart was murdered by Officer Connor Schilling, and he subsequently got a doctor to say he had post-traumatic stress disorder. And so he retired and is still being paid taxpayer money for his retirement. So I think that summarizes where we are, because not much has changed in the last 5 years. In 2016, there was a huge demonstration that many people talk about, which was the bridge demonstration. I-240 bridge was shut down for several hours, and people were demanding some conversation around structural and systemic changes to law enforcement. The current police director was the interim police director at the time. He was there on the bridge with us. As we marched down from the bridge to the FedEx Forum, by the time we get to the FedEx Forum, although there was a commitment to have a conversation about structural changes, by the time we got to the FedEx Forum, which would have been a matter of 30, 40 minutes maybe, he changed the narrative into promise me 30 days of no killing. So what we have right now, 5 years later, which is exacerbated by what I call the unholy trinity of COVID-19, which led to high unemployment, which led to people not being able to detach from these images that Commissioner Sawyer talked about before, or these narratives that were being produced on television because of the death of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. So now you have people who are trying to get concrete conversations on the table, but you also have a law enforcement apparatus, a political infrastructure that is hell bent on maintaining these inequities. And so every time you try to push people to the wall, and we had conversations with elected officials 4 years ago, and I know the legacy goes back a lot further than that, but people just don't seem willing to have the substantive conversation. And we've seen even in recent days, this administration say, instead of talking about the substantive or the structural, we want to do the symbolic and the sentimental. So that's where we are, and we have to continue to try to keep people's feet to the fire if we want the type of substantive and structural changes that we need.
Commissioner Sawyer, would you like to add, just in terms of your own experience, particularly as an elected official and lawmaker and engaged citizen?
Absolutely. I would also like to add to where we are as we're framing this time period. We're approaching one of the most important elections in our history. The 2020 presidential election is going to not just shape the next 4 years, it's going to shape the story of 2020. This moment, this meme of a year that we're in, and what's happening, as I also am the national field director for Black Voters Matter. What's happening in our community is that you're toggling between apathy and a belief that we can change everything in one night. That if we go to the polls in November and we make a change in who's the president of this country, what we've been facing for the last 4 years, which is a small percentage of what we've been facing for 400 years, will go away. I struggle with that belief because I don't believe it. And my concern is that too many people do. Black, white, Latinx, that a change in the presidency or a change in the governor or a change in the senator is going to remove the racist structures that are as deep as the roots of the oldest tree in this country. Right now, we're watching people take statues down, and across the country, people are saying, wait, no, that guy was okay, but this guy wasn't. And when we look at the roots, again, back to the roots of what America is to the Black person, I smiled a bit when Professor Wright, Dr. Wright spoke, because I heard his cadence Baldwin-esque a bit, and when he said my father, my brother, it goes back to when James Baldwin says, how much time do you want for your progress? You ask for my father's time, my brother's time, my mother's time, my niece and nephew's time, my time. How much time do you want for your progress? And so we're still being told to wait. We're still being told if everything goes right on November 8th, we're going to be okay. But the president of the country and none of the candidates have broken any of the systemic racist structures that exist. Springdale will still be the poorest district in the city, sitting behind the richest college campus. That will still happen on the day after the presidential election. And so what we can't do in this moment is go back to sleep, no matter what we see change with our vote. It's important for us to vote. And it's also important for us to remember that no matter who's in office anywhere in this country, whether it's Tami Sawyer or Joe Biden, we have individually to break the racist systemic structures that are all around us, that make decisions about where grocery stores are and how bus lines run, who gets to go to college and who doesn't. We have to continue to fight that every day until we see it eradicated.
Dr. Turner, could I add a little more spice to Commissioner Sawyer's commentary, because I think what she's accenting is something that I don't think gets connected to the criminal injustice apparatus enough, that it is an extension of a broader system and structure of injustice and inequity, whereby we don't have the luxury of just talking about one particular incident, one particular entity, because even if you change, I remember a conversation several years ago, if we had a more progressive police director, and there's a police director search that's on the horizon right now. And the fact is, unless we change the systemic structural issues, it does not matter how progressive or how bright or how brilliant the next police director is, you'll still have to deal with those broader structural challenges. So criminal justice is an extension of a system and a structure rooted in a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist, heterosexist narrative and reality that ultimately makes it difficult for all of us to exist in a more equitable and just society.
Whoa, so you all have gone deep in terms of, identifying the need to really look at systems of oppression and systems of injustice. As Commissioner Sawyer said, it's a lot easier, I'm paraphrasing, but it's a lot easier to think about going into a voting booth and pulling a lever, or thinking about the hiring of new leadership, than it is to sort of dig deep and begin to address those underlying systems. And so what I'd like to know, and I imagine that members of our audience would be wrestling or grappling with this as well, how do we, as individuals, or as communities, begin to really address the systemic issues? How do we do that?
So right now, everybody wants a syllabus, right? They want to know what books to read, what movies to watch. And there's now even a backlash. There's a syllabus against the syllabus, right? Don't read how to be an anti-racist, read how to be an anti-racist. I mean, I watched a whole Facebook thread where somebody was like, but I just bought it. Oh, wait, read it again, and they're just going back and forth. But I'll just really quickly, because you asked us, to not be as loquacious as we tend to be, even though Dr. Wright came out his shell and shamed us all. No. But I'll just say that, this is 2020. I would say 6 or 7 years old, 6 or 7 years ago, I was not Tami Sawyer today, right? 6 or 7 years ago, my worldview was a very privileged one. I was second generation, middle class, college graduate, raised with a phenomenal amount of educational privilege for a Black girl from Tennessee. And what was most important to me was, am I going to keep going for GS14, or am I going to open a cupcake shop? My interactions with the police were happening on U Street in DC, and if somebody got arrested, it was probably their fault because they hung out too late at our favorite bar. And why I'm telling people this is because I lecture a lot in my social media. I recognize I lecture. My dad says she loves to be right, but hates to be told she's wrong herself. And he's right. But the point is that I learned through me. I broke my own mirror. And it's almost an Alice in Wonderland journey that you have to go through. You have to break the looking glass to break the broader systemic structures. Because if we go back to the root analogy, we are branches of a diseased tree, and until we choose to fall off and be our own trees, I'm losing the analogy here, but until we choose to break off from that tree, we're always going to uphold it unknowingly. And you have to constantly, grow where you're planted and fix yourself. But the way that you address racism or any other ism is you challenge yourself. I challenge internal homophobia. I challenge internal anti-Blackness. I challenge internalized classism all the time. I have to challenge myself every day. And if you wake up and you think you solved racism because you voted for the Democratic candidate, you know, people start statuses talking to me all the time with, well, Tami, I voted for you, but I disagree with you about this Black Lives Matter thing. But they think they're right because they once voted for me. That 1 second in their life, they think erases any racism in their body. But I would tell you all day long, I catch myself operating in the isms. And if I wasn't looking in a broken mirror every day, realizing the imperfectness of the system that I was raised in, not through the fault of my parents, but through the structure of America, if I wasn't willing to do that, I could never be as bold as I am in breaking the structures. Because until you break the structures inside you, you can't do it elsewhere. No book's going to teach you that. But there's a lot of great books you should read along the way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I appreciate that. And it points to that importance of self-reflection first, and then the need to sort of look outward, but we have to look inward first, is what I'm hearing you say. Okay. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and I'm appreciating that the questions are rolling in. And one of the questions that has been posted is, what is the most effective way to educate someone, whether it's a friend, coworker, perhaps family member, that racism does exist and is just as much an issue today as it was during the 1960s or slavery era? Any thoughts about that?
I can jump in on that one. And it really dovetails with what Commissioner Sawyer was just speaking about in terms of advancing the cause. And I'm speaking more so to allies, wannabe allies, would-be allies. And I've heard this or read this quote on social media somewhere, but I really like it. And the quote is, I don't want allies, I want accomplices.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be ready when the moment comes. You need to be ready to talk to Uncle Jim at the Thanksgiving table about how he is perpetuating all of these isms that Commissioner Sawyer talked about. You need to be ready to possibly lose family members, possibly lose friends, create a new network from which to deal with. The type of way that we can advance it is to simply challenge injustice when you see it. And I'm thinking specifically about an example from a couple of days ago. Saw it on social media the other day in Philadelphia, where a young Black man simply said to some diners who were eating outside to put a mask on. You're dining close together and you don't have a mask on. And later we found out the owner of one of the bars was sitting there. His response to that request was to pull out a gun and aim it at the young man.
Mm.
It was a white woman who stood up and put her body literally between the gun and the Black man, who's had a lock in his hand, and to try to calm him down. So in terms of advancing and educating people, I'm tired. That's uncompensated labor. When I get requests on email, social media, what can I do to learn? Well, there are many books. Do a Google search. You can do that. But the most important thing I think you can do is to start where you're at. Start in your home. Start in your family. Start with your friends. Start with your neighbors, and encourage them to do the right thing. And they know what their right thing is.
And if they don't, if the root of this question is how do you convince somebody of the obvious, then I would just simply say that's a battle that cannot be won with any, realistic effort that will not drive one crazy. So if someone has not recognized the realities of racism in the 21st century, then I would ask them to give me the address to the rock that they have been living under, because I want to visit when I'm ready to get away. But in the meanwhile, for those of us who have to deal with these harsh realities day to day, if they are wanting to learn more about it, then find somebody who is doing this type of work, whether it be somebody who is writing about it and researching about it, whether it's somebody like Commissioner Sawyer doing policy work or organizing work, whether it's somebody who is preaching about it, or practicing justice-oriented practices on a daily basis, then sit down or go alongside them. And to Dr. Wright's point, don't try to ask them for uncompensated labor, because that reifies the exploitation and the inequities that we are trying to offset now.
I appreciate that. I am actually looking at one of the questions that just came in from one of our colleagues here at Rhodes College. It's a comment and then also a question. And what he says is that the problem with dismantling systemic racism is that those who are in power benefit from it and they rely on it. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that. And so the question he raises is, what will convince those in power to give it up short of a revolution? And the criminal justice system has powerful people who won't give up that privilege willingly. And so what are we to do given that systemic injustice benefits those who might be hesitant to give up the privilege that they receive? Your thoughts on that?
Short of a revolution, nothing. I mean, that's the reality. And I think there are different types of revolutions, though. So, like, let's be clear. Revolutions have happened in this country. Some were bloodless, some were silent. Revolutions have to happen. But short of a revolution, we're not changing the criminal justice system in a massive enough way here in this country. You know, everyone will say Black Lives Matter today. When we started doing this work in the city 5 years ago, I mean, everywhere we went, but why Black Lives Matter though? Why y'all couldn't say ... right? Why Black Lives Matter? Does my white life not matter? You know, ... I still get called a racist. That's people's favorite thing to call me to this day. I think someone wrote on my Facebook page yesterday and said, "You are so full of hatred for white people." You know, I got white friends. That's what y'all say, right? I have really good, but I do have good white friends. But I don't have hatred for white people. I have deep love for Black people and a deep commitment to our liberation and freedom. But short of a real revolution, no, the criminal justice system is not going to change. When cotton was destroyed, what was replaced as the moneymaker, the bottom line of capitalism, were bodies. And the only way for people to get free labor was through arresting Black men for vagrancy, for not having jobs, for changing jobs without permission, right? Read anything about the Reconstruction and look at today, and you see why we are here. At one point, there was a realization that Black people would really very quickly be in the Senate, be the next president, right? Be the professors, be the doctors. And in less than 2 decades, that was shut down.
Backlash.
And so those bodies, parchment, which today is now half closed because of the way it's deteriorated, but we were still putting bodies in there. Parchment existed to take Black men who refused to sharecrop and put them in jail and make them sharecrop, right? So the South continued. The cotton gin of the South never stopped churning. It just ain't picking cotton no more, okay? And so without a real revolution, there's no way to dismantle the fact that Black bodies exist to mass produce for a consumer-based, systemically racist society.
And I think it's a relatively contemporary phenomenon to demand this level of negotiation with injustice and to require those who are being exploited and oppressed to have a flawless plan that is 150% nonviolent, non-abrasive, whatever other creative maneuver you could think of, which would make us have to do something other than sacrifice something. To Commissioner Sawyer's point, there is going to be no concrete structural reality of a just society without somebody having to sacrifice something. And really, I would say without everybody having to sacrifice something.
Okay, thank you. I want to switch gears just a little bit and take a look at some of the things that we're seeing emerging in terms of responses to the violence that we're seeing. I was doing a bit of research, and one of the things I know is that the activist group Campaign Zero recently released its 8 Can't Wait campaign that includes 8 recommendations to immediately decrease police violence. And it includes things such as banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring warnings before shootings, exhausting all alternatives prior to shooting. They talk about the duty to intervene. They talk about the ban on shooting at moving vehicles, requiring the use of force continuum, and requiring comprehensive reporting. And I was pleased to see that the Memphis Police Department has issued a statement saying that they are already implementing these practices or best practices. And so is this promising? Is this something that we can look to? I've noticed that other police departments around the country are also signing on to the 8 Can't Wait campaign. So is this something that you all support? Is this an answer for us?
So I was go ahead, please, Commissioner Sawyer, please.
Wait
No.
just a minute. I want to point to Dr. Wright first.
Right, there you go.
Dr. Wright, what are your thoughts about this? And then we'll go to our more loquacious colleagues. How about that?
Sure. These seem to be commonsensical, easy policy to implement, and one would wonder why they have not been implemented nationally everywhere. They're common sense, so much so that why would they need to be codified? De-escalation and all these other things. But I think it speaks to a larger failure that we're seeing now that Commissioner Sawyer alluded to on the federal level. Not only is there a lack of leadership on the pandemic taking place, there's a lack of leadership in trying to develop a set of federal policies that can be used as a guideline by which to address the issues of policing. But I think it's a minimal first step that is somewhat lacking.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Sawyer?
I agree with Dr. Wright. It's the very minimal first step. It's so much so that 2 of the founders of 8 Can't Wait denounced it in later days, Brittany Packnett and Sam Sway, because the louder call is 8 towards abolition. And people don't want to have a conversation about defunding or abolition because it's so extreme to them, right? But remember, again, 5 years ago, people refused to say Black Lives Matter. And so when you introduce an idea into the lexicon, people will want to push against it, right? Or, push it off. That's socialism, that's communism, whatever they want to call it. But the thing about 8 Can't Wait is exactly what Dr. Wright said. Just about every law enforcement agency across the country has said, great, thanks, we do that already. That's what MPD says. So we know there's issues with MPD. We know that there's things that MPD refuses to do, have a cleared body with a subpoena power, right? Publish a roster of police officers who have either received a reprimand or been fired for extensive use of force, and so on and so forth. Fire or publish police officers who have been in domestic violence situations. so we could go on and on about those things that they currently don't do. And so anytime you say you're doing reform and within a week everyone's like, we do that already, it's not reform at all. It's not reform enough. We did pass a can't wait on the county commission, and of course, you know, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, I would just like to state that the sheriff already does all these things, so I'm glad we're joining the sheriff. Well, we're joining the sheriff. That's not reform.
Okay.
And as the elders and ancestors in my faith tradition would say, the devil is in the details. So we could talk about the police department saying that they're banning chokeholds, but they have a caveat that 8 Can't Wait does not have. And the caveat for the local police department is, unless an officer is in fear of their life, which we know is the same rhetorical trope that is used oftentimes when lethal force, usually with a gun, is used against mostly unarmed African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would want to applaud these maneuvers as a step in the right direction. But as Baldwin would say, I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. Mm-hmm. And what they have done is presented, as a rhetorical studies scholar, I pay close attention to the language. Where the local police department is not saying that they agree with or are implementing the substance of even 8 Can't Wait. Until Commissioner Sawyer's point, we know where that stands with the originators of that. They're saying they are in compliance with the sentiment. And what I'm suggesting, and what many of us are suggesting, is we don't need sentimentality. We don't need symbolism. We need systemic, structural, substantive changes. And I'm not confident that they are committed to that.
So talk to us about 8 to Abolish. What is that movement and how does it differ?
So I don't know all of the 8 items, but 8 to Abolish is more about the abolishment of the criminal justice system as it is today. And when we're saying abolishment, you know, a lot of people will say, well, we can't live without a police department, or, you know, you're anti-police and police put their lives on the line. And thanks to Google, 8 to Abolition is defunding the police, demilitarizing communities. So I just saw a comment, and I'm going to try to, the person who wrote it is right. We are speaking in very academia. So demilitarized communities, meaning, you know, right now, if you look at the budget of the sheriff, they spend a lot of money on riot gear, on tanks. We get new police cars every year. So demilitarizing, for those at home, would mean that we're not spending that type of money. Why does the sheriff's department, why does the Memphis Police Department need 6 tanks in a city like Memphis, right? What could that have done in a school or community center? Removing police from school. Kids are actually organizing, youth are actually organizing in Memphis around this. Bridges and other programs. Stand for Children has been working with kids all summer around the impact of police in their schools. It doesn't make them feel safe. They say that it actually makes them feel like criminals. It actually causes stress and anxiety. Freeing people from prisons and jails. Currently, the 201 Poplar is being sued. Shelby County is being sued because when COVID-19 hit, so many people inside 201 got infected, and they're at home. They're in jail for things like not being able to pay $100 to get out of jail. All right, and the other 4 really quickly is repealing laws that criminalize survival. You know, that's panhandling, right? When we are arresting you for asking for money on a street, when we are putting stakes in the middle of a park so you can't lay down, repealing those type of laws, investing in community self-governance. If Dr. Wright and I get in a fight, should we call the police, or can Dr. Turner come help us solve that, right? Providing safe housing for everyone. Housing instability is a question in the Q&A. I believe Dr. Haas asked that. Housing instability is one of the largest issues tied to poverty here in Shelby County, and it's only going to get worse with COVID-19. Over 10,000 people scheduled for eviction, and a third of the kids in Shelby County School experience some type of homelessness every year. And finally, investing in care, not cops. What does it look like for us to hire more mental health workers instead of more young police officers? What does it look like for us to encourage our high school graduates and our college graduates to enter into youth mentorship programs, mental health care programs, mutual aid work, instead of learning how to arrest people and use violence? It is a world where we care for each other instead of where we put the problems on existing on a police force that responds to that stress, that responds to that existence with violence.
Okay.
So I guess I didn't know what it was.
I appreciate that. And I also appreciate how you were sensitive to the questions that some of our audience members are asking, and you just sort of wrap those in. And so for those of you in the audience, we see your questions. And thankfully, our panelists can see them, and we are responding to them as we are able. Okay. I see another comment, and Commissioner Sawyer, you already acknowledged it, but I just want to offer this as a reminder to all of us. One member of the audience says that we are speaking like academics, and most Memphians are not academics who are, they're not academics, but they're people who are seeking real life practical solutions. And so as a reminder to all of us, let's try to make sure that we're talking in practical terms about police reform and systemic racism. And so for the audience participant who brought that to our attention, we really appreciate that. And so we thank you, and we will try to honor that. So one of the other, I'm just looking at some of the other questions. There's a question about what conversations are taking place within the Shelby County School Board for their complicity in the criminal injustice system, particularly related to literacy deficits. And beyond MPD and the mayor's office, is there or are there ways that we can sort of unpack what's happening within our education system here?
Dr. Wright, I think I saw you on mute.
Yes, I did, but my answer is not specific to the Memphis City school system, but more broadly. And I'm going to attempt to do what my favorite morning host, Joe Madison, says, encourages us to do, put it where the ghost can get it. One of the problems we have with the over-policing in our communities, the oversaturation, the overemphasis of officers in our communities, is the assumption that more crime takes place in Black and brown neighborhoods than white communities. That is not true. It's simply that you have more officers in that space, so you have more people being arrested for crimes. Now, the school to prison pipeline is an issue. Our young people are caught up in that at an early age. They're more likely to then enter into the system. Why does that matter? Now I'm going to try to speak in my North Memphis way. Private prisons. Private prisons are a problem. Why are they a problem? Because it's like McDonald's. If we open a McDonald's, what is the way in which we are going to make profit? Sell burgers and fries. If we open a private prison, how are we going to make money? We need bodies in those facilities. So part of the problem with policing is that the laws are crafted by the privileged classes in societies in ways that do not overly penalize the crimes they are more apt to engage in: powder cocaine, other high-cost drugs. as opposed to quote unquote street drugs and street crimes. So you have this increase in the number of Black and brown people put in prison. Now, connect this to what Commissioner Sawyer said previously. King Cotton used to be the thing that made money around here. Now, what makes money? Black and brown bodies. You have in Tennessee, one third of all persons incarcerated, nearly one third, are in private facilities. In the United States, 8% of all incarcerated persons are in private facilities. These are for-profit entities. What are they doing with those bodies? They are making fisheries in the state of Colorado, meaning they're fish farms in Colorado. How does that hurt us? It takes jobs away from those of us who are not incarcerated. It lowers the wages for those of us who are not incarcerated. But for those who are caught in that snare of the over-policing, their bodies are exploited in ways that are similar to what has happened for generations. So I think it's incumbent upon us to look at the ways in which, beyond the immediate ways in which our lives could end, but how our lives could be used by the state, and those monies procured by the state go to their profit and not ours.
So I think that one of the things that was asked in that question is what's being done about SES. And there are people that I still want to believe in who lead Shelby County schools. And so I still hold out hope because I asked people to believe in me, and a lot of people had given up on the ability of elected officials to raise awareness to certain issues. And sometimes I can't change anything. All I can do is raise awareness. I'm one of 13 people, you know. My dad will tell you, he says, you know, he watches my votes, and very often it's 12-1. But I also have a big gong, and I bang it. And I'm talking about things you haven't seen the Shelby County Commission talk about, if ever. And I believe in some of the people running for office in the school board now, and some of the people who are currently in can do that and can do more of it. And I'll just say, you know, really quickly that, I mean, Dr. Wright just hit the nail on the head. Why educate our kids if we're going to send them away, you know, to mass produce it while in jail for the rest of their lives? Why would the power structure spend that money to teach if they're just going to, you know, put out the fires in California in homes they'll never be able to afford, anybody in their family? Here, you know, Black people are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 in the United States. Guess who's mass producing the mask? Inmates.
Wow.
And if nothing else
Wow.
drives that home, think about that.
Mm-hmm.
The ACLU is suing prisons across this country, Dr. Turner, because we refuse to let people go home for low-level, nonviolent infractions. We refuse to clear out the jails in a pandemic, right? We won't let you go get a drink, but you can sit in a overcrowded jail cell. And you can make the mask for the people who are at home. And what do you get for it? A penny a mask, maybe a dime a mask if you're lucky. Cuomo is the most lauded politician in this country right now. Everyone loves the way he stepped up and took it to Trump. He is the first one to get inmates to make hand sanitizers and masks, right? Mm-hmm. Hiding one hand and pitching with the other. And so that's embedded in our education. There's a reason we're not teaching our kids to read. 1 in 3. I say this, Earl, we've been together a long time. He'll tell you 1 in 3. Anytime I can, I'm going to tell you. You know what that number is? It's the number of Black boys that'll see the inside of a jail cell before the age of 18. 1 in 6, the number of Black girls that'll see the inside of a jail before the age of 18. 1 in 17, the number of Latino children of any gender that'll see the inside of a jail cell. Okay, and it's not because they're bad. It's not because their parents aren't home. It's because they don't have the same quality education. They don't have the same quality healthcare. It's because they have to get on a bus and ride 30 minutes to find a red apple. and we know these things, we have to change them. And you have to elect people who are willing. If your elected official isn't talking like this, they got some work to do. I shouldn't be the only one or one of few.
A question from an audience member. Can you all talk about the bail bond issue here within criminal justice and how that complicates the situation?
So I think Commissioner Sawyer was already leaning into it insofar as we have people, because one of the questions from one of the participants is what kind of policies will we recommend? And I think here's one. So we know that we have a lot of people who are incarcerated right now, haven't been convicted of anything. And oftentimes it's low level offenses that have them incarcerated, but they are too poor to be able to afford bail. But you also have people, somebody I was talking to, a pastor I was talking to yesterday said, if you actually eradicated poverty in Memphis, which would minimize the number of crimes in Memphis, most people who work downtown wouldn't have a job. And
Can you say that again?
He said if we actually eradicated poverty in Memphis, which would lower the number of crimes in Memphis, most people who work downtown would not have a job, which is to say that our society and structure, and especially the big business, which takes place downtown in most communities, is actually undergirded by a system and a structure that is committed to increasing poverty and using incarceration as a means of funding the inequity. So bail bondsmen down there actually make a lot of money paying people's bail who are too poor to afford it. So what if we, as the official Black Lives Matter Memphis chapter and many others are advocating for around the country, what if we eliminated cash bail? That's a concrete policy that people have been advocating to be put on the table, because nobody should be in jail who has not been convicted of a crime and are serving time simply because they are too poor to afford the money for bail. So that's just, one thing. And I think that captures the sentiment of that particular question. I would also, Sister Shirley Bondon, Esquire, by the way, who made the comment about us talking in the terms that we're talking in. And I think that is also, and there was Dr. Robert Harvey, who asked the question about the school system. And I think that these questions in concert and in collaboration actually articulate the indictment of the inequities in our system, like Commissioner Sawyer was talking about, whereby 1 in 3 African-American boys are expected to be in jail by the time that they're 18. And to Dr. Wright's point, people are assessing the size and the scope of the correctional facilities based upon these statistics. So obviously we have to do a revolutionary reimagining and restructuring of the ways in which our society is built up, because most of us encounter these injustices and inequities even when we aren't paying attention to it.
Okay. I see a question from a fellow sociologist, Dr. Turner, another Dr. Turner, who wants someone to sort of speak to the issue of restoring voting rights for felons and efforts to overturn sentencing laws such as mandatory minimum sentencing. Is there anyone who could speak to that?
I mean, here in Memphis, a lot of that work has been led by the official Black Lives Matter chapter, as well as Just City. Senator Ramesh Akbari, when she was a state representative, led a lot of that work at the state level. We are currently working on ban the box resolution at the county level, but we're scratching the surface. Tennessee is a red state. I mean, in our conversation, we had commission meeting today, and in our conversation around ban the box, people kept asking for exemptions. Oh, well, this office deals with very important paperwork. They'll be exempted, right? And they're still holding on to the belief that if you go to jail, you're charged with a felony, you go to jail and you serve your time, you're not rehabilitated, quote unquote. So we can't trust you with this paperwork, right? I can't trust you with this driver's license number. I can't trust you with marriage records. You know, you won't shred them, or you won't come to work on time. So there's still this negative belief about felons. So I work around felony, the reinstatement into our society of people who served time for felonies. Our work around that is slow. It's dangerously slow, because our jails are filling quicker than we figure out how to treat these folks with humanity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm acknowledging some of the other comments we've received. We have an audience member who writes to share a comment that's related specifically about that systemic injustice that we were referring to earlier. And this particular writer is from India and makes a point that in India, there are those same systemic issues that African Americans here face. And so those systemic issues are truly entrenched, and movement towards progress often happens very, very slowly because it takes time to really address those challenges. And so I really appreciate that particular observation. Another question, how do we teach our communities that police should not be warriors, but rather protectors of the peace and protectors of those who are abused by true criminals? How do we begin to help shape that message?
I think some of that is to teach the history of policing. I'm from Benton Harbor, Michigan. It's a small city, southwest corner of Michigan, 90 miles east of Chicago. And there's about 12,000 people total in the city when I was growing up. Nevertheless, here are the police departments that if I was standing at the corner of Broadway and Empire and there's a store called BJ's that everybody hung out at, here's the police departments whose patrol cars you would see come through the neighborhood in a matter of 10 minutes. You would have the Benton Harbor City Police Department. You would have Benton Township Police Department. You would have Berrien County Police Department. And you would have State of Michigan Police Department. All in the city, 12,000 people, deeply impoverished, right? So obviously they aren't there to protect and serve. And even what we see in Memphis, and you can go through the litany list of things from the blacklist to the federal court suit that's happening right now to modify the consent decree in Memphis and Shelby County, again, as true of the broader scope of the country and the history of policing. In Black communities, the police are there to punish and surveil. In white communities, they're there to protect and serve. So one of the ways that we could teach our kids about what the true need and nature of police officers' roles and responsibilities are is, watch this, wait for it, take them to a white community and have them sit there for a minute. That's why the hashtag arrest me like I'm white or police me like I'm white has become so prominent. Because at the end of the day, we do know how to do it. We just refuse to do it in the communities of color.
Thank you. Our time is coming to a close. There are a number of other questions that we have not had an opportunity to get to, but as we are preparing to close, there is one question that was submitted by one of our audience members that I'd like to pose to each of you. And this might be a really good place for us to rest after you've had a chance to respond. But the question that this particular audience member asks is, how do you measure progress towards a more just society? Isn't that a great question?
So I'll go first to get it over with. Every time somebody talks to me about progress, I think about Malcolm X's quote. He says, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and take it out 6, we don't call that progress. That you don't call it progress until not only is the knife removed, but you have to repair the wound. And I do think it is fair to say the knife is not as far in the back of our people as it once was. But it is also fair to say we cannot run a victory lap and talk about much progress. Because, for instance, the poverty report that the University of Memphis through the National Civil Rights Museum has put out for the past couple of years have shown, even in the last 50 years, with all of what we do to try to commemorate Dr. King and his fight for equity and justice, the numbers still say that the wealth gap is the same. The poverty rate is about the same. And I'm not trying to sound like what Dr. Andre Johnson would call a pessimistic prophet, but I am trying to be a pragmatic realist. And I'm saying that as much as we could talk about whatever progress has been made, we have to be more honest about the harsh realities that we still face. And so not until we can concretely see those numbers move and change, that you close the wealth gap, that those numbers that Commissioner Sawyer cited are lowered, that the poverty rate is lowered, and things of that nature, then we can speak more about what it means for us to envision and embrace a more progressive reality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
I'll just also really quickly, I like to quote one of my favorite modern scholars, Dr. Charles Mckinney. I believe he works at Rhodes, I think.
I think I heard of him.
That guy. Yeah. But Dr. McKinney, has said frequently, you want me to give you hope. I'm not going to end this panel with my hope-filled kumbaya. I'm not going to sing. I'm not going to dance. We are in hard times. We're in the midst of that revolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I will say is that we're always looking for indicators, right? Because we want something to hold on to keep going. What I hold on to is that my chosen ancestors and my ancestors, they didn't know what progress was going to look like, except waking up and living another day and surviving. And so we can keep going. And there's Brittany Packnett, who was one of the original writers of 8 Can't Wait. She says, look at yourself and ask what kind of ancestor you want to be. I don't believe we're doing this work right now. I don't think we're doing it for 2020. I think we're doing it for our grandkids and the great grandkids who are going to look us up on some thin tablet and follow the census and see what we were up to and, whatever type of tech they have. We're doing this work for future generations. So what kind of ancestor do we want to be? What kind of progress are we making that can be built on in 2040 and 2060? And then one more quick thing that I wanted to say about this selling of hope, right? How and how we measure this progress. I do want to say what progress is not, right? Progress is not that Obama got elected. Progress is not that Tami Sawyer got elected. Progress is not new apartments on Jackson Avenue. We can't keep spraying rose-colored perfume over the situation and saying that, hey, look, things are better. Because that was the big mistake of the 80s and the 90s. And I'm not old enough to remember how those mistakes were made, but I read a lot. And we were lulled into a belief that achieving middle-class educated status as Black people was going to save us. We were watching our families destroyed by crack, and we were watching the communities we grew up and loved in destroyed as well. And so we found safety and solace in middle-class living. But the systems were always there and still churning. And so we can't believe progress is an E-class. We can't believe progress is the diplomas on the wall. Progress has to happen for all of us. We have to remove the classism. We have to remove the sexism. We have to remove the ableism and, the homophobia and so on and so forth. Progress has to be for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to get in before Commissioner Sawyer because I knew what was going to happen there. That's a tough act to follow. But not only do Dr. Fisher and I share the same first name, we share the same mindset and to some degree, because I was going to mention that same quote by Malcolm X, and that progress for me and advancement includes pulling that knife all the way out and healing the wound. But in the process of pulling that knife out, there will be some casualties along the way. Some people who will be left behind, whether literally or figuratively, like the snap of Thanos' finger. Some people will dissipate, those who are in the way of progress. So ultimately, where I look at progress and how to judge it is how the least of thee are doing. Mm-hmm. How are the numbers looking for those of us who are in the worst conditions? Do we improve those numbers? Do we make the numbers not even an issue relative to what's taking place in our nation, judging by our standards and not by the standards of another nation? And until we reach the point to where there's equity on each and every level, then we have work to do, and equality will not be found. But I remain hopeful.
Wow. That is profound. Several of you made reference to the Malcolm X quote about repairing the wound. And that reminds me of a concept that many of our Jewish brothers and sisters embrace that has to do tikkun olam, which means repairing the world, which I think is a responsibility that we all certainly share. I'm going to take the liberty of also answering that question for myself, just by way of wrapping up our conversation. I think about our efforts to measure progress towards a more just society begins with our engaging in difficult conversations and having the difficult dialogues and engaging in conversations very much like this. When I opened the panel tonight, I talked about how, for institutions like Rhodes, where there is a commitment to being inclusive and just, certainly that is a goal that many of us aspire to achieve. But we know that given our present circumstances and also given our past, it's not easy to do that without the self-reflection and the desire to ensure that our actions are matching what we say is important. Do we do what we say is important? And are we engaging in the difficult work of turning things around, turning the ships around, really helping to create a society that sees progress, not surface level things, but really, I like the way Dr. Wright said it, that we're really focusing on the least of these and understanding how progress among the least of these, which is a term that we talk about in our own Christian theology, but applies worldwide, until we are sure that the least of these are those who are most oppressed or who experience the most injustice in our society. Until we ensure that they're doing better, we know that we have not made progress. I would like to take this opportunity to really thank each of our panelists, Commissioner Sawyer, Reverend Dr. Fisher, Dr. Wright, for taking the time to really start off this conversation about policing and Black communities. As I've mentioned before, this is the first conversation in a series. Next week on July 15th, the conversation will focus on looking to the past. We have a team of historians who will help us to understand how we got to this place. And help us to sort of contextualize it by taking a historical approach. And then in 2 weeks on July 22nd, the focus is going to be on looking towards the future and realizing what a just tomorrow will look like. And it's my understanding that those questions that we engaged in earlier today about 8 can't wait and 8 to abolish, I know I probably said that wrong, but we know that some of those questions will be taking place or taken up at that time. Again, I want to thank President Haas at Spelman. We know that this is the kind of conversation that many college presidents are running from. And so I'm very thankful that we have a president here at Rhodes who is running to these kinds of conversations and dialogue, and who recognizes the importance of these conversations for helping us to move forward. I also want to just say a word of appreciation to our communications staff, and also to our information services staff who really helped us to make this event possible. We really appreciate your work and your support of this event. And again, to our organizers, Dr. Loins, Dr. Marchand, and Dr. Holtz, we thank you for getting these conversations started. For our audience, there are, as I mentioned, there are other questions that you've raised that we were not able to get to. We will keep up with those and share them with our future panels, but we certainly hope that you will continue to be with us as we engage in these conversations. But more than that, we hope that you will be our partners in bringing about a fair and just society that we all want to see. And so I thank you again. I'm Sherry Turner, Vice President for Strategic Initiatives here at Rhodes College and Chief Diversity Officer. I thank you.